As far as making me happy, my orchids make me very happy. I just love being down there, especially in the wintertime when it's cold outside. I spend hours and hours just puttering around, repotting, looking at my plants, moving things around. It's just so much fun and so relaxing. It's like, sometimes I'll tell my wife I'm going down to the orchid room for a half hour, and then 3 hours or 4 hours later, she's down there looking for me saying, "What are you doing? I thought you were coming back up in 30 minutes. And I just get lost down there. No matter what time of the year it is, when I'm down there, it's always a nice light breeze. It's sunny and in the mid 70s, mid to low 70s. So it's a real escape from the cold of winter and the heat of summer.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the Get Up and Grow podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Schauberg. Today, we're excited to have on the show Albert Tamashausky, who has grown orchids for almost 50 years in New Jersey and is part of the American Orchid Society and other major orchid groves. He is also an engineer who has built an underground greenhouse and an old brewery to create the perfect environment to mimic the cloud forests of Papua New Guinea. You won't want to miss this episode as we learn more about different types of orchids and how to grow them under lights indoors. So sit back and enjoy my conversation with Albert Tamashausky. Hi, Albert. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for spending the morning where you are.
Hi, Taylor. Nice to meet you.
So I'm really excited to have you on. You're an expert in growing orchids. You've built this really interesting facility to create this environment for your orchids. You're also an engineer. I'd really like to kind of start getting into some of that, but I just wanted to first start off asking you, how did you first become interested in caring for orchids?
Well, back in the mid 70s, probably 74, 75, houseplants were all the rage, and I got interested in growing houseplants. And then ultimately I started growing bromeliads, mostly tillandsias. That was my specialty, the genus Tillandsia. And then a friend recommended that I look at orchids as, possible plants to grow. So I started to, investigate orchids, bought a few, and then got very interested in orchids. And then around that same time, probably 75, I found an orchid grower. I lived in Union, New Jersey at the time, and there was an orchid grower called Lager and Hurl Orchids in Summit, New Jersey. And they were probably one of the oldest orchid establishments in the country. I got to know the owner, John Lager, and eventually I was a biology major at Kane College at that time, and I dropped out of college to go to work for Lager and Hurl Orchids. So I worked there for probably 2 years and learned about growing orchids and got really interested in the hobby.
And you've been growing orchids ever since, so it's been 50 years.
Figure 1975, so 47 years, something like that.
Right.
My interest is primarily miniature. Yep.
Miniature orchids.
I think
what is the difference between miniature and regular besides the size?
Well, not a whole lot. I mean, there's most of what I grow, or a good part of what I grow, are in the genus Dendrobium. And Dendrobium plants can be as small as the whole plant, a half-inch tall to 3 feet tall. So there's not a lot of difference in the flower characteristics or the plants themselves. It's just the size. So, a miniature orchid
interesting.
is not miniaturized, but they're miniature by nature. So they're small, they stay small regardless of how you grow them. So in other words, they're not miniature because of their environment. They're miniature, they evolved in environments where they became miniaturized, and that's now in their genes to be small, miniature.
Okay. And you mentioned you mainly grow dendrobiums. Is that the correct pronunciation?
Yeah, dendrobiums. I grow all sorts of miniatures. There's a subtribe called Pleurothalidae. So the genus Pleurothallis, Masdevallia, Stellus, Lepanthes, Dracula, the genus Dracula. So any of the small pleurothalids I grow. But my favorites are the miniature dendrobiums, primarily in the group that used to be referred to as oxyglossum dendrobiums. They kind of split that up now. But my
Hmm.
favorite plant species would be Dendrobium cuthbertsonii, as well as the other miniature dendrobiums that grow in Papua New Guinea and Southeast Asia.
Okay. And why is that your
And
favorite?
the plants are maybe 2 to 4 inches tall, and they have flowers that are an inch across. So you can imagine a little small plant that's 2 or 3 inches or 4 inches tall, covered with blooms that are an inch across. So they're spectacular in the fact that the flowers are so colorful and so large compared to the size of the plants. They also have a beautiful leaf
Interesting.
structure and texture. The leaves are covered with tiny little warts, so they have a beautiful texture. When I look at my when I classify myself as a grower, I classify myself as a leaf man as opposed to a flower man. Flowers are great, but most of the time you're looking at leaves because the plants are not always in flower. So if I don't
Hmm.
like the way a plant looks out of flower, I'm not interested in it. And the plants I grow have usually beautiful leaf structures and overall symmetry in plant structure.
So you're looking for symmetrical plants. When you're looking at orchids, that's kind of the goal to be symmetrical.
Not really symmetrical, but just an overall beautiful display of the foliage, the growth stems, with or without flowers. And I should have brought a couple of
Okay.
plants upstairs so I could show it to you, but I didn't think of doing that.
Oh, it's okay. You post some photos of your work on a few pages on Facebook where people can find you. You have a couple groups there. Is that right? Uh,
I
is
don't
it the
have groups that I.
you have the North Jersey Orchid Society group? Okay.
Yeah, I'm a member of the North Jersey Orchid Society group. There's a couple of miniature orchid groups that I'm a member of. I'm a member of the Dendrobium species group. There's also a couple of under light groups I'm a member of. I don't know the exact names of them, but they're good places to display your
Okay.
plants and also to get advice from growers.
Hmm. Do you find that there's useful information out there for orchid growers when it comes to, you know, how to care for your type of orchid, or are you kind of teaching other people from your experience?
Well, I guess I teach people from my experience, but there's a lot of great information on the internet about growing miniature orchids. There's a
Hmm.
site, I forget the name of it. It's or either Dendrobiums of Papua New Guinea or species of Papua New Guinea, and they have extensive information on growing the types of miniatures that I grow, including habitat information, temperatures, exposure, the altitude they grow at, etc. When you're growing an orchid, the more
Hmm.
you can find out about its native habitat, the easier it is for you as a grower to duplicate that habitat artificially so they keep your plants happy. Um, the Dendrobium cuthbertsonii types and relatives that I grow are typically high altitude cloud forest orchids. So even though they grow in the tropics, they grow high enough above sea level where the temperatures are cool year round. So when you know that, you're able to duplicate those environmental conditions in your synthetic environment.
Okay, we're going to get into
Um,
your synthetic environment. Have you traveled to Papua New Guinea yourself?
no, I haven't.
No. Okay, just so people are aware, you're talking about dendrobiums. What are the other main classes of orchids? This is our you're our first orchid guest. I kind of just want to give people the lowdown. Like, what are the dendrobiums are one. What are the other main
Oh,
categories?
well, the orchid family is top of the food chain in evolution. So I believe they're the most highly evolved of all plants. And there's also
Really?
valid species of orchids. So there's, or 40 to 50,000. So there's more species of orchids than any other plant family. Um, there's many different types of orchids. They grow on all continents except for
Okay.
Antarctica. Some that are familiar to hobbyist growers would be Phalaenopsis, which are the plants you can buy in the box stores. Cattleyas, Oncidiums, Paphiopedilums,
Hmm.
Phragmipediums, Catasetums. There's hundreds of different genera that are grown by hobbyists. Habitats are anywhere from near desert conditions to tropical cloud forests. I grow primarily epiphytic orchids, which are plants that grow attached to other plants. They grow attached to trees. They're not parasites, but they're epiphytes. So they use a tree or a bush as a holdfast to grow on. And there's also terrestrial orchids that grow in the soil, like some cypripediums, for example, lady slipper orchids. They grow in the ground. I have very few of those. I grow primarily epiphytic orchids. It's a plant that grows attached to another plant. Not all orchids, but many orchids are
Okay.
obligatory epiphytes, so they have to grow attached to a tree or, a bush or something above the ground. They do that so they can get up where the sunlight is,
And why did they do that?
to get into the area where the sunlight is. But if you think about a
Excellent.
rainforest or a dense tropical forest, when you get down to the ground
Got
level,
you.
it's pretty much shaded. So in order to avoid the shade, get to the sun where the energy is, they grow high up in the trees or on the trunks of trees.
Okay. So are the plants that you are growing, do they require a lot of light, a little bit of light, or
Everything.
high light requirement?
I have probably 1,000 orchids, and so I have species that like shade, that like medium bright light, and that like bright light. So I adjust the position of the plants in my light bays to reflect the light requirements of a specific species. So plants that need high light, I would put high, close to the.
Okay. Before we get into kind of the light stuff, maybe we can talk about your setup, your growing setup. You said you want to mimic a Papua New Guinea environment. I know a little bit about your background. I read that you converted a facility that used to produce alcohol, beer, and you converted that facility into an orchid space. So how did you do that, and what was the reason for
Well,
doing that?
originally I grew under lights in a conventional home. Um, and in 1981, I met this woman who lived down the street from where I used to live. Serendipity, you could call it. And she owned a house that was actually a 19th century brewery. So if you go in the basement of this house, which is the house I'm living in now, there's actually a door that goes through the foundation out into an actual loggering cave that was built in the 1860s. That's about 8 feet below the surface, the roof of the cave. And they built this loggering cave. It's an arch. It's 12 foot wide at the base. 8 foot high at the center of the arch and 30 feet deep. It's underground, so it's cool, it's moist,
Wow.
temperature is pretty stable. Anyway, I met this woman, and she showed me her orchid, or not her orchid cave. She showed me this lagering cave in the basement, and I walked in this cave and said, "Wow, this is like a high altitude cloud forest environment, and man, you could grow some great orchids in here if you had the right setup." So ultimately, I married this woman. That's my wife,
Mm-hmm.
and I moved my orchids over here when we got married, and I built the structure
Oh,
in the cave because it had to be enclosed so it didn't have water dripping on it, and it was because it would be wired with electricity, it had to be dry, or not dry but drip free inside. I built this orchid structure, this room, and the room is about 8 feet wide, maybe 20 feet long, and about 6.5 or 7 feet high. So I built it to fit inside of the arched cave, and that's where I grow my orchids now.
wow. And so we didn't get into it too much, but you're an
That's right.
engineer by trade. And did that help or contribute to you kind
Yeah.
of
Well,
designing
my
this
degree is in
facility?
chemical engineering, so it helped in that when you take courses in engineering, you learn a certain way to think, and solve problems. So I guess from that standpoint, my engineering background helped me think things through using the scientific method to design the structure. But I think more or less it was hit or miss, and I learned by my mistakes over the years. I think my background in chemical engineering helps me more with things
Mm.
like calculating concentrations for fertilizer and that sort of thing, solution science, solution chemistry. But I don't do anything in the cave that any layperson couldn't do.
Do you mind explaining a bit about how you built this facility? Like, what did you need to do to convert over to an orchid grow? You mentioned some of it with the sizing, but what are some of the other things you
Sure,
had to do? Maybe a
sure.
little more
Well,
detail.
um, the cave. If you're looking down from the top, you can imagine the floor of the cave as a rectangle that's 30 feet by 12 feet. So within that rectangle, I gave myself enough room to have a pathway to walk along the side of the orchid setup to get into the cave, because when you step down into the room, you turn, you walk parallel with the long axis of the room, and then you make a right turn and you enter the orchid room from the back of the cave. So anyway, I took cinder blocks, and the floor of the cave was relatively level. I'll start by saying that. And I laid cinder blocks in a rough um, outline of about 8 feet by 20 feet. And then on top of the cinder blocks, I put a treated lumber plate, a 2x4 plate, like you would do for a building. And then I built walls out of treated lumber, and then a crude roof. And then I attached 1 inch thick closed pore polystyrene to the sides, 2 inch thick closed pore polystyrene to the roof, built a door on one end, and then draped the whole thing with heavy duty polyethylene sheeting, both sides and top. And that's basically the enclosure. It's very simple.
Hmm.
So it's 2x4 walls. Yes,
So it's all closed up within the
yes. And
cave. So it's like
there's
a greenhouse in the cave.
on the one side, on one of the end walls,
Okay.
I have two fans mounted in so I can circulate air if I want to from the cave into the room. Um, The door, of course, I can keep open or closed depending on how I'm trying to monitor the air circulation or the temperature. Now, most of the year, the cave cools down at night because the plants I grow like to be in the mid 50s at night. So I maintain that at night by just opening the door of the cave and opening the door of the orchid room and letting the cave air in. In the summer, the cave warms up a bit because there's a vent in the back of the cave that goes up to the surface. So some warm air comes down through the vent. And also the room itself gives off a certain amount of heat from the lighting and the fans. So that tends to warm up the cave. So what I did for summertime is I built a fin and tube heat exchanger, which is basically just hot water fin and tube heat exchange material. And I have 3 rows of that and a fan mounted behind it. And I pump spring water through the fin and tube heat exchanger, and I blow air across that at night during usually anywhere from 52 degrees Fahrenheit, which would be my winter temperatures. And in the summer, when it starts warming up, with the use of the cooler that I built, the chiller, I'm able to get the night temperature down to 57. My daytime temperatures are typically between 68 and 75. And the temperature goes up because of the heat given off by the LED tubes in the fans.
That's amazing. Yeah, we're gonna have to share links to photos after this so people can just see what that looks like. So that's it for your setup. Maybe can you walk us through your day to day, the process of growing and caring for these orchids when their growth in this environment?
Light, they need water, and they need a temperature environment that duplicates their own environment. So they're the 3 things that I'll say struggle with. The light is relatively easy because I use these LED tubes, and they provide sufficient light. And I adjust the light level, of course, by just moving plants from one place to another, closer to the tubes, further away from the tubes. So that's relatively easy. The problem with adjusting for light, though, is that sometimes it takes a little bit, it takes a long time before you start to see whether a plant needs more or less light. But you work with that. The temperature, I explained how I deal with temperature. And that's relatively easy for me because of the fact I'm underground, so my temperature is stable. I'm not dealing with someone. I'm not dealing with the conditions that someone in a greenhouse would have to deal with. For example, if there's one of these awful New Jersey heat waves where you have 90 plus degree days for 3 weeks, people have greenhouse or pulling their hair out of their heads trying to keep their greenhouses cool. I never have that problem. No matter how hot it is outside, my temperature in the cave never goes above 75, which is perfect. My biggest challenge is water, dealing with watering, because I have so many plants next to each other. It's hard to water in a way that allows all the plants to get what they need. So if I have a plant that likes to be kept moist next to a group of plants that like to dry out, it gets very tricky watering to make sure that the plants that are moist stay moist and the plants that need to dry out, dry out. And because I have so many plants, it's hard to segregate things specifically into wet and dry areas. I try, but I struggle with that. So watering is my biggest challenge.
Okay. You mentioned a little bit about lighting, and this episode's going to be trying to focus on that a little bit more. I'm wondering if you could walk through the lighting situation.
As technology changed and the wattages were reduced to T8, where the 32 watt, I went over to those to save energy. Um, the problem I had, with conventional fluorescents were two problems. One was they produce a lot of heat,
Right.
so it was a little more difficult to control the temperature in the room year round, actually. And the other problem was the fluorescent lights lighting. Sometimes they would be hard to get them to light to start because of the temperature, the high humidity, and the cool temperatures in the cave. I conquered that problem, the lighting problem, by going over to solid state ballast. They seem to be more dependable in getting the tubes to start. I still had the temperature problem, though, and of course the high energy cost. When LED lights came out, I was a little bit hesitant for a few years because I wasn't sure of the technology.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, I gave it a try and found that the LED lights worked just fine. They cut my power use in half, and the temperature, the output, the heat output of an LED, as most people know. So by going to LEDs, I not only improved by cutting my power use in half, I also lowered the temperature of the room, making it much easier to control the heat output. The way an LED works, or the way a fluorescent light works, is completely different than an LED. A fluorescent light, there's actually a filament inside of the fluorescent light that glows, and it causes the mercury in the light to vaporize and form a gas phase, and then that mercury gas phase conducts electrons from one end of the tube to the other, giving off UV, which excites the phosphor in the tube. All those processes that happen in a fluorescent light give off a lot of heat. And of course, as a grower, you realize that heat in the area, in the light areas. The LEDs are solid state. I use the ballast operated lamps, and I have a reason for that. Because I'm spraying water all over the place, I don't want 120 volt house current going to the tubes where I'm spraying them with water. The idea of a ballast is it cuts down the current, increases the voltage, but cuts down the current. So there's a little bit of let's say, a buffer between me and the water and the house current when you use a ballast. So I always think of the ballast as being safer in my setup. I don't spray the lamps intentionally, but they do get overspray. And I've never had an incident, a short or anything with them.
Okay. And what about spectrum?
I've compared them to other LED lights, and your tubes seem to fit right in there, in that they supply the right spectrum required for what's called photosynthetically active radiation. They seem right in there where they need to be to provide the plants with what they need. I've not actually measured the spectrum myself with a light meter, but my plants are fat and happy, so I assume I'm giving them the right light of the right quality.
I think you're using the sun white light spectrums lamps, and I think that in the reason we developed that product was because we wanted to mimic a natural outdoor environment by adding far red light, as you'd see in nature. So I'm happy to hear that it's doing the same for you.
As far as making it sustainable, my switching over to LEDs to reduce energy consumption, I guess that helps the sustainability, if you want to call it that, of the hobby. But there's nothing really environmentally sustainable probably about any hobby. Probably nothing sustainable about any hobby, unless you're talking about growing native plants or something that's actually outside and benefiting the environment directly. As far as making me happy, my orchids make me very happy. I just love being down there, especially in the wintertime when it's cold outside. I spend hours and hours just puttering around, repotting, looking at my plants. moving things around. It's just so much fun and so relaxing. It's like, sometimes I'll tell my wife I'm going down to the orchid room for a half hour, and then 3 hours or 4 hours later, she's down there looking for me saying, what are you doing? I thought you were coming back up in 30 minutes. And I just get lost down there. No matter what time of the year it is, when I'm down there, it's always a nice light breeze. It's sunny and in the mid 70s, mid to low 70s. So it's a real escape from the cold of winter and the heat of summer. It's a real man cave.
So I'm assuming you don't have a winter place in Florida. You just can go down to your orchid room.
Yeah, I don't think I could ever live in Florida. Too hot.
Well, Albert, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. You've been such a great supporter of our business, and I'm just happy to speak with experts like you that have so much to share and to give. So I think this is going to be super informative for a lot of people out there. I just want to say thank you again for your time, and I appreciate you.